Fantastic to be here. It's fantastic to be here. It's a fantastic way to end the week, being able to share some really great information about how ABA can really be useful in everyday life. And so my name is Janet, and Yendri here is our co-presenter. So I'd like to give it over to you, Yendri.
Hi, everyone.
So we're really excited to be here. And this is, as Annabelle said, our second webinar from the series. And this is a webinar that I have to say, and Yendri and I are definitely together on this, in that the topic that we're going to talk about, preventing and decreasing problem behavior, is just an area that I think we can all attest to in one way or another. Either through myself as a practitioner and Yendri as well, working with children across different ages, as well as the parents that are joining us. And so really the point and the purpose of the topic for today is to really have you walk away with some strategies that you can start using right away. So to continue this topic forward, I just wanted to formally introduce ourselves. So my name is Janet, and Yendri is co-presenting. Actually, she'll be joining us on the next webinar that will be in Spanish, which is amazing. So I'd like to share a little bit about Yendri for those of you guys that weren't able to join us on the first webinar. So Yendri is a fantastic behavior analyst. She has years of experience as a practitioner, as a trainer, as an instructional designer. And one of her passions is training the up-and-coming behavior analysts. So she and her team at Scalometry have designed an outstanding RBT training program. And she, to this point, which is such an amazing accomplishment, has trained over 1,500 individuals and have helped so many people become RBTs. So Yendri, thank you for all of the work that you do, and certainly the practitioners that you're bringing forward to our field. As far as for me, as I mentioned, I'm Janet. I'm also a board certified behavior analyst. I've been practicing for about, in the field for about 20 years. I love what I do. I've worked as a practitioner. I've owned and operated an ABA company. And so I definitely have seen all facets, if you will, of ABA as a service. And then the other passion that I have, if I'm not running an ABA or providing ABA services, is I love to teach. So this is a passion that Yendri and I share so much. I actually teach at the local university here, Florida International University, both intro and advanced courses in behavior analysis. So the topics that we're going to cover today, now that you know a little bit about us, is we're going to kick us off with a brief summary of webinar 1, because I know a lot of you were able to attend that, but just in case you weren't, we're just going to bring you up to speed before we go into the topic for today. But then bullet number 3 and bullet number 4 is really where the bulk of our time is going to be spent. And we're going to give you very tangible things that you can do to not only prevent behavior altogether, but also, if it does happen, how to respond and how to decrease it from happening again. And then, of course, we're going to end our time together with questions from you, because we definitely want you guys walking away with information that you can apply right away. Okay, so for, again, just a brief little summary of webinar 1. So the goal of this mini-series is to teach basic principles and to really formulate an understanding of how these principles and variables affect behavior, and not just your child's behavior, but our behavior too. And as we talked about in webinar 1, that is backed with oodles and years of science to really narrow down and position us where we have confidence in these strategies and principles that affect behavior. And at the end of the day, what these things do for you is it can significantly impact your life, in that it can give you these strategies to be able to work with your child, and whether it's teaching new behaviors, which we're going to talk about in the next webinar, or if it's working on a problem behavior today that's happening that you'd like to reduce. So it will definitely have direct application to your day-to-day life. And as a byproduct, increase the quality of your life. So as you guys may know, this is a three-part series. Webinar 1 was an introduction. Webinar 2, which is today, is preventing and decreasing problem behavior. And then webinar 3, which is another great topic. And Yendri can definitely attest to this, because when we were taking our full Kidvincible program and truncating it into this mini series, it was so hard to pick and choose the topics to just, cover in 3 webinars. But definitely webinar 2 and 3 are things that we can attest from our daily lives as practitioners that have so much utility, can have so much utility in your life. Okay, so let's get down to the summary of webinar 1. So what we really did in webinar 1 was lay the groundwork for some of these key variables, these key concepts that we really need to understand to be able to really wrap our head around how behavior works. So not only what makes behavior happen in the future, but also what makes it come out, right? And so some of the concepts that we talked about were these 4 on the screen that you see here. So motivating operation, antecedent, behavior, and consequence. So let's just take a quick little moment to refresh ourselves on what these key concepts are. So when we talk about motivating operations, we're talking about something that happens before the behavior, and it's something that essentially decreases or increases the value of something. So an example that we used last time was food, right? So if you haven't eaten in 8 hours, that's going to increase the value of food. Versus if you just ate, that's going to decrease the value of food. So that we call that a motivating operation. Then we have an antecedent. Now, an antecedent also is something that comes before the behavior, but this has a very different role. The antecedent is actually something that triggers the behavior. It makes it come out, right? The presence of that, whatever that antecedent is, then brings out this behavior, triggers that behavior. But then what we also learned from webinar 1 was that behavior analysts and ABA has a very specific way of looking at behavior. And the 3 characteristics, if you will, of behavior that we use to really hone in on whether or not this is something we can target ourselves as practitioners, you as a parent, is it observable? Is it describable? And is it measurable, right? So we want to be able to see, hear, and take data on it. But then because we can see and hear it, we want to be able to describe it. So those 3 things really hone us in on on the characteristics of what behavior is. And then the last concept that we talked about is the concept of a consequence. And everything that we talked about as far as the motivating operation and the antecedent are things that happen before the behavior, whereas the consequences it's something that happens afterwards. But it also is responsible for essentially determining if that behavior is going to increase in the future or decrease in the future. And it ultimately depends upon what type of consequence it is, right? So now this is a visual depiction, and this will look very familiar for those of you guys that were with us last webinar, on how these variables operate together, right? So as I mentioned, the motivating operation is something that happens before. The antecedent is something that happens before. And that really, think of those as the motivating operation setting the stage for the behavior, the antecedent triggering that behavior, and then the consequence, notice that that's something that happens afterwards that essentially indicates whether something's going to happen again or it's not. Now, we also talked about, and for the sake of time, I didn't put it on the slide here, but last webinar, we talked about 2 other concepts related to the consequence. We talked about the process of reinforcement, and then we talked about the process of punishment. Now, if a process of reinforcement is at play, then that means that the behavior is going to be more likely in the future versus punishment. We learned that punishment is a process that happens after the behavior, but it has a very different effect than the reinforcement. It actually decreases the likelihood of that behavior happening in the future. So that was, we essentially took an hour of our time and consolidated it down to about, 3 or 4 minutes, but that's what we learned the last webinar. So now let's get into our topic for today. And the topic for today is all about preventing and maintaining behavior. And we're going to go about this in 2 different ways. And actually, if you guys will bear with me, I'm going to go back to the previous slide. So we're going to give you strategies that essentially affect the antecedent, right? So it's something that you're doing before the behavior occurs that prevents it from happening. And you guys will see that we really love these kind of strategies, because then it stops the behavior altogether, right? You never have to encounter it. Now, a good approach is one where you have some antecedent strategies, but you also have some consequence strategies. But you'll see that when we get to the antecedent strategies, we went a little heavy on those, because man, if you can prevent that behavior from happening altogether, then I feel like you're further ahead. But the consequence-based strategies, we're going to give you a few of those as well. And those, as I mentioned before, are the ones that happen after the behavior. And those are important because sometimes your antecedent strategies don't prevent the behavior for one reason or another. Maybe the environment is slightly different, that it didn't prevent the behavior. So then when the behavior occurs, you have to be able to respond to that behavior. And that's where your consequence-based approach can be helpful. So let's take a look first at our antecedent-based strategies. So we already determined that these are strategies that happen before the behavior occurs. So let's actually dive into our first poll question. So if you guys give me one moment, I'm going to launch this poll and see if you guys grasped all those wonderful concepts from the first webinar. So the first question that I have for you guys is, when we talk about antecedent strategies, what do we know about them? Is it A, it comes before the behavior happens? Is it B, can prevent problem behavior before it happens and promote good behavior? C, typically it only has short-term effects on behavior? Or D, all of the above? So take a moment to think about that. And I see some of you guys already chimed in. I'm going to give just a few more moments to see if we get anybody else chiming in here. Okay, so let's digest our answers here, because it looks like we have a mixed bag here of responses. And you guys are all technically correct. So A is true. So for those of you guys that thought it was A, you're absolutely right. So these antecedent strategies, because they're strategies that are tackling that antecedent variable, they're going to come before the behavior, right? So that's true. Now let's look at somebody else responded C. Typically only have short-term effects on behavior. Now, even though we didn't directly talk about that, that is also true. Because as I mentioned, I alluded to this, that sometimes those antecedent strategies break down, right? Either because the environment is different, or there's something new in the environment that then the behavior occurs, so you have to be able to respond. So that's what we talk about when we refer to these short-term effects. But then some of you responded D, all of the above. Now, technically the right answer is D, all of the above, but I did want to give a shout out to everybody that responded A and C, because those are technically correct, but all of them are correct. So kudos to you guys. All right, so let's keep going here. Okay, so there's going to be several antecedent strategies. And as I mentioned, Yendri and I went a little heavy on this because we definitely love these antecedent strategies. And we're going to give you 6. Now, the disclaimer I have to put out there into the universe is that these are not the only antecedent strategies that science has tested and is tried and true that are available for us to use. But in the interest of time, because we only have an hour, we chose these 6 because we felt that these are definitely strategies that are easier to use, and because they're easier to use, can be put in right away and be immediately useful for you. Okay, so the first one is non-contingent attention, and I'm going to describe what that is. Then we're going to talk about giving choices. We're going to talk about something that's called behavior momentum. Sounds fancy, but once I describe it, you guys are going to see that it's not as fancy as it sounds. We're going to talk about the importance of instruction clarity and how to frame instructions. And we're also going to talk about fading in tasks. And then the last thing is we're going to talk about another strategy surrounding giving advance notice. So let's first look into the first 2 strategies on that list. So let's take a look at non-contingent attention. So when we talk about something being non-contingent, it's really just a way of saying that you're going to give attention based on a predetermined time schedule. So an example that I'll give you is if, let's say, we're using this strategy of non-contingent attention, is you're going to say, okay, well, I'm going to give my child attention once every hour, right? Now there are, and we'll talk about this a little bit more, but there are very strategic ways that you want to be able to determine how often to set that schedule, and so how many times to give that attention. But just for the sake of wrapping our heads around what this is, it would be something like that. So, okay, you're going to give attention to the child once per hour, but it's irrespective of the behavior, right? So it's not like, you'll see that with the consequence-based strategies, we're looking for a behavior, right? And then once that behavior happens, we're going to do something. Whereas you see with these antecedent strategies, what they have in common is we're not looking for a particular behavior. We're just doing something to the environment to try and prevent that behavior from happening. So in the case of non-contingent attention, what we're doing is if we find, so in the previous webinar, you learned these 4 functions of behavior, one of them being attention, right? And you find that a particular behavior is maintained by attention. If you provide attention periodically throughout the day, in my example, let's say once per hour, then what that will do is it will lower the value of attention. Remember, we talked about motivating operations, right? So it'll lower the value of attention. So what does that mean to you and your child in problem behavior? It means that if your child is doing something to get your attention, but you're already providing attention throughout the day through this non-contingent attention strategy, then it means that your child is going to be less likely to engage in the problem behavior for attention, because the value of attention has gone down because you've already been providing it, right? So that's also, now, a kind of disclaimer that I will add with that strategy is we listed it as non-contingent attention because so much behavior is maintained by attention, but just be mindful that that strategy, that providing something on a time-based basis, can be used for anything. So it can be, maybe you provide, let's say your behavior is maintained because the child wants his iPad, right? Or so maybe, like we talked about last webinar, access to tangibles, we call that. Then you could provide that iPad on a periodic basis. So even though this says non-contingent attention, just keep that in the back of your mind, that it can be something else that's contingent upon time. But because it's not contingent upon a behavior, we call it non-contingent. So that's the first strategy, right? The second antecedent strategy is giving choices. Now, I know that this sounds, so simple, and some of you guys might be thinking, well, I think I'm already doing this. But one of the things that we have to be mindful when we're giving choices is that we want to be able to give choices, particularly when it comes to things that maybe the child isn't thrilled about doing, right? So if, let's say there's, let's say you give a child a choice between their 2 favorite things, maybe it's their iPad and watching their favorite TV show, right? Well, that's an easier choice to make, right? And it's great that you're giving that choice. But when we talk about the strategy of giving choices, we're really talking about giving choices when it comes to tasks that are less preferred. So it's one of these situations where it's like, okay, I know that there's this chore that the child needs to do. So what I can do to be able to use this antecedent strategy is I can say, okay, I know I need the child to either put away his toys, or let's say another example would be maybe put his shoes in his closet, right? Well, providing a choice at that moment could be, do you want to, going up to your child and saying, hey, do you want to put away your toys now, or do you want to put away your shoes? Now, it's not that he's getting out of his chores, right? Because that's not the point of offering choices. You know, you're still going to ask the child to do something, but you're giving choices on those less preferred tasks. And so that's something, and Yendri, I can see her nodding her head, because that's something as practitioners that we use quite a bit. And so an example that I can definitely attest to from my days as a therapist is, if let's say I was working on coloring, you know, so maybe some fine motor skills with a child, and versus working on, let's say, doing some sight reading, and let's say these are both programs that I know my child is not really thrilled about, this is where I can use this strategy. Hey, Johnny, do you want to color, or do you want to read? And then he would choose, and we'd go and do it. So that's definitely a simple but very powerful strategy that you can use. So now I put the next two on the screen here. So it's behavior momentum and using clear, appropriate instruction. So let's take a look at behavior momentum first. This is one of those other strategies that sounds fancy, like the non-contingent attention, but it's actually really, really simple. All this involves is, if let's say you know you're going to have to ask your child to do something that always triggers problem behavior, right? Let's say, like, every time you ask him to do his homework, it's a big blow up, right? You can use behavior momentum and think of it just like it sounds. You're kind of building this momentum of compliance by, in the way that you're doing that is you're asking your child to do a couple little things first, right? So instead of asking them right off the bat, do this hour-long homework that you know is going to lead to a breakdown or some type of problem behavior, instead you can ask for little things first, right? So maybe it's hey, can you, put something away, or something simple that they can do. Can you put your homework on the table? Can you just put your pencil on the table? And then so you build up like 3 to 5 little things that they can do. And as I said, what that does is, if they're little simple things that they can do, then they will comply. And what it actually does is build this momentum of compliance. And by building this momentum of compliance, actually what you're doing theoretically is you're actually reducing the value of escape. So now that goes into the motivating operation variable, right? So this is also another little strategy, that if you know that you're going to have to ask your child to do something big that's going to lead to like some type of problem behavior, you can think of just maybe 3 little things that you can ask for first to build that momentum of compliance, and then come in with the task. And here's the key, though, that when you issue those little things to do first, you want to make sure that you're providing what we call reinforcement, which we talked about in webinar 1. So if, let's say you said to them, take out your pencil, you want to make sure that you reinforce that behavior. And what I mean by that is, it could look something like this, like, hey, little Johnny, can you take out your pencil? He takes out his pencil. Oh, thank you so much for taking out your pencil. That's great. Hey, can you take out your workbook? And then he takes it out. That's great. I love the way that you took out that workbook. And that's what I mean about reinforcing every single instance of those smaller tasks that you're asking. So that's what we call behavior momentum. And then now let's take a look at the 4th strategy that you can use. And this is something I'm really passionate about, because it's something that is so easy to tweak, but can make an enormous impact on the outcome of the behavior. And so when we talk about using clear, age-appropriate instruction, yes, we have to make sure that we're using language that the child can understand. But what we're also talking about is making sure that your instruction includes what you want the child to do, not what you want them not to do. So like a perfect example is, let's say your child runs into the door with his book bag and he's knocking everything down, right? And that's a problem, right? Because something can break, right? So what we can sometimes find ourselves doing is say to the child, stop running, right? That's an instruction, and it's age appropriate because it's using language that the child can understand. But what that does is, because I'm highlighting what not to do, what that's doing is then leaving to the child's, discretion, if you will. What am I supposed to be doing then, right? Am I supposed to be skipping? Am I supposed to be galloping? So that's where using very clear and appropriate instruction is really, really helpful. So in that instance, if your child comes in running with his book bag, right? Instead, what you want to say, hey, can you walk, please, right? So you're using very clear instruction that is indicating the behavior that you're looking for. So that's really, really important when it comes to giving instruction. And I have to say, in my experience, and Yendri, I know you can attest to this, that all these other strategies like a non-contingent attention and behavior momentum and giving choices are all really useful strategies. But sometimes those are not even necessary if you have very clear, specific instructions that trigger the behavior that you're looking for. Sometimes that's enough to get what you need. So if I highlight any of these antecedent strategies, number 4 for me definitely takes the top of the list. And now, rethinking this slide, this presentation, maybe I should have put that one first. But that's definitely a very easy one. So next time you're giving your child instruction, I encourage you to think to yourself, am I telling my child exactly what I want him or her to do? Because if I'm not, then remember, you're leaving it up to their discretion to determine what they think they should be doing. And so I invite you in those opportunities to then remember our time together and think to yourself, okay, what do I want my child to do? And let me give instruction that targets that. Okay, so now let's go to the 5th antecedent strategy here, and that's to gradually fade in tasks. So instead of going back to the example of the homework, right? And I love to use homework as an example because a lot of my kiddos that I worked with out in the field, homework was such a point of contention, right? And so one of the things that you could do, and certainly that I did as a behavior analyst, is, okay, if I see that the child comes home with an hour-long worth of homework, but I can barely get this child to do right now 5 minutes, then for me as a practitioner, I'm looking at that and saying, it's unrealistic for me to think I'm going to get this child to do an hour right now. But what I can do is I can gradually fade in those tasks, right? So I can slowly increase the expectation, right? So like, I know now, some situations may constrain this, because if, let's say, you have homework that's due tomorrow, then you don't, in certain circumstances, you don't have the luxury of slowly fading it in. So you have to, this one you have to take a look and see what the situation will allow. But, I've worked with children where they were given homework assignments that were for the week, right? So they gave the homework assignments on Monday, and then they had like a homework packet, right? And then they had the entire week to do it. And so it was up to the family and the child to kind of pace out the work. That is a perfect opportunity to use this strategy of gradually fading in tasks. So if, let's say, the homework packet has 10 sheets, right? And let's say day 1, you do a half of one, and he does it beautifully. Reinforce that behavior. Day 2, try to get to one full one, and then build your way up until by the end of the week, you can get to the number of sheets that you need. So that's a really good one. But the caveat there is that you have to look at the situation and determine if you have the luxury of gradually fading in tasks. So now let's look at strategy number 6. Inform the child of what is next on the schedule. Now, I can tell you that this is easier said than done, particularly as a parent, but I think it's an important one to know. I know as parents, there are always a million things going on. You're trying, let's say you have some work things that you're doing, and let's say if you have one child that has to go to soccer, and then the other child that's going to swimming class, and then the other one that's going to tutoring, and then all these things that you're juggling that definitely it's a packed schedule, and it's sometimes very difficult to give advance warning. But this strategy of informing the child of what is next on the schedule can help mitigate these outbursts. So when you can, try to introduce, it's particularly things that are routine things, right? Definitely, get those into the routine of, okay, remember, we're going to go to swimming today. But where this is also very, very helpful is when it's not a routine thing. Right? So if okay, well, we were supposed to go to swimming, but swimming got moved, and so now we're going to go to karate instead today. If you can give your child notice as early as possible, right? So maybe before they go to school, you start having that conversation. Remember, Johnny, we're going to go to karate after school today. And then, when you pick them up, remember, we're going to go to karate afterwards. So try to give them those notices for things that are routine if you know that they're still not aware that it's up and coming. But definitely it's particularly helpful when it's something that's coming up out of the routine. Okay, so let's go to our next poll question. So those are 6 simple strategies that really you could start using today. And so let's go to the next poll here. Give me one moment. I'm going to pull it up here, and let's launch this poll. So the question is, which of the following is not an antecedent strategy? Is it A, giving choices, B, ignoring junk behavior, C, providing clear instructions, or D, gradually fading in tasks? So take a moment to think about that. Oh my goodness, you guys are such a smart bunch. You guys already responded, and let me share these results with you guys, and all of you guys were spot on. Yeah, ignoring junk behavior is not an antecedent strategy. All of the others are. And we're actually going to talk about what junk behavior is, and that's going to be a strategy that we're going to actually move into in a little bit. But you guys are super spot on that. Okay, so now that we talked about the 6 antecedent strategies that you can use, now let's switch gears and talk about what we can do that are consequence-based strategies. So remember, these are things that you're doing after the behavior. Now you'll notice that some of these are contingent, meaning they happen after the problem behavior, but some of these are actually happening after the behavior that you want. But it still indicates, it's still categorized, I should say, as a consequence-based strategy because it's coming after the behavior that you're looking for. Okay, so there's 5 that we're going to give you. And that includes behavior contracts. The next one is called first then strategies. The third one is ignoring junk behavior. The fourth one is timeout, and the 5th one is response blocking. Now, a little disclaimer I'll put here is that the second one, if you're an ABA junkie like me and love to learn all of the scientific concepts, the second strategy here, first then strategies, actually does have a different name. It's called the PREMAC principle, but we call it first then strategies because you'll see that when I talk about it, it's just such an easy way to remember it because it involves indicating what comes first and then what's going to happen next. But we'll talk about that more in just a moment. But let's first look at behavioral contracting. Now, some of you may already be doing this. And so if you are, kudos to you. So maybe some of the information that we're going to give you here on the screen will help kind of enhance what you're already doing. But for those of you who aren't, this is something that what I love about behavior contracts is that you can really tailor it across age, your child's age. So you can use it with your younger child, but then you can also use it with your older child, even if they're, let's say, teenagers, And so let's talk about first what a behavior contract is. So it's essentially, just like it sounds, a written contract. It's a written agreement that identifies what expectations you have of the child and what's going to happen if they meet those expectations. Now, there's a couple of things you have to keep in mind when you're trying to put this contract together for your child. Is one, you have to make sure it's age appropriate, right? So you want to keep it simple. So if, let's say, your child is younger, say, let's say your child is a 4-year-old versus your child's a 14-year-old, right? With the 4-year-old, you're going to want to keep it simple, put your clothes away after school, right? Let's say for the 14-year-old, you can get much more elaborate. I want you to, complete all your assignments and, whatever, it can be much more elaborate, and the languaging that you're using there can obviously be much more complex, right? But definitely, if you're using this on your younger children, not only do you want to keep the language simple, but you also want to make it attractive. So when I use behavior contracts with my kiddos when out in the field, I would make it colorful. I'd put their favorite character on it. So if they loved, let's say Dora the Explorer, then I put Dora on there. So you want to make the actual contract itself attractive, right? Now, for the older, so if, let's say, you're using this with your teenager, then this is, doing that is definitely not going to be as important. But for the younger guys, it really does help. And then but the most important piece is that you want to make this contract positive. And what I mean by that is, just like with the instructions, right? When we talked about the antecedent strategies of telling the child what you want them to do, it's the same thing here. Keep it positive. When you do this great thing will happen, as opposed to when you do this, you're going to lose that, right? So you want to keep the behavioral contract positive. Tell them what what's the advantage. Essentially, it's communicating the value of that behavior, right? What do I get out of it if I do it? So now that we understand that about a behavior contract, let's talk about what to include on this contract. Now, this is regardless if they're younger or older, but again, the languaging therein is going to vary, or the complexity of that language, I should say. So when we talk about what to include, we're talking about obviously indicate the behaviors that you want, right? And you want to tell them what you want them to do, so the appropriate behaviors. You also want to include when and how often you want to see this behavior. So, for instance, with our, let's say our little guy running into the home with his backpack, right? And then let's say he just throws the backpack on the floor, which what you want is for him to put it in his closet. So the appropriate behavior would be take your backpack to the closet every day after school. That's the when and the how often, right? And then the third bullet here is what will be earned. And so when little Johnny, so that's what he's going to get out of it, right? So let's say, so little Johnny is going to put his backpack in the closet after school every day, right? And when he does that, he's going to earn, let's say, 5 additional minutes of TV time before homework time, something like that. And then the contract, so not only does it have to include all that, but it also has to indicate, when it's going to start, when it's going to end, when you're going to review it, and then if the child can, their signature. And the reason you want to get those signatures is, think about when you sign a contract in your everyday life, right? It's a behavior that's committing to this, right? And so for the older, your older children, it definitely has that effect. For the younger ones, it's just a fun thing that starts to bring them to interact with this contract, right? And it can be something fun that you celebrate. But it definitely for the younger guys, what I've seen this do is that it just helps to start building that exposure, that interaction with the contract. Okay, so now let's go to our next question here. So I'm going to pull up the poll here. Okay, so when we talk about a behavior contract, what should it include? Should it include A, the appropriate behavior you want to see, B, when and how often you want to see the appropriate behavior, C, what the child will earn if he or she engages in the appropriate behavior, or D, all of the above? Okay, so I'll give you guys just a moment to respond there. Although you guys are such a sharp bunch that I don't even think you need it because I see all these wonderful responses coming in. All right, you guys are super, super awesome. I'm going to share these results and you guys all got it correct. All of these are important things to include in your behavior contract. Okay, so let's keep going here. So then we talked about a behavior contract. And one of the things, and on a side note, and I'll wrap up our behavior contract conversation on this note, a great location that I have learned to put your behavior contract is your refrigerator. And so I would definitely encourage you guys, that's a place where, you know, your kids are always going to be there and that they'll see every day. But that's the other thing, even though it wasn't on the slide, another recommendation for when using a behavior contract is to make sure it's somewhere visible. And definitely even visible when it's not in use, because just the seeing that behavior contract is going to serve as an antecedent, as a prompt to, oh, I got to engage in this behavior, which is exactly what you want it to do for you. Okay, so now let's go into the second consequence-based strategy. So these strategies after the behavior occurs. And that's these if-then strategies, AKA what we, in the scientific literature, we call the Premack principle. And it's just called the Premack principle because it was named after the person who discovered it. But I think if-then is an easier way to remember it. So you guys are probably doing this. I know for my consequence-based strategies, this was probably one of my go-tos all the time. So for the antecedent side, giving the clear instruction was definitely my go-to. But on the consequence-based side, the Premack, it was one of my top 5 favorite strategies of all the strategies. And what it involves is setting up, you guys learned in webinar 1, the concept of a contingency, right? Which is just 2 things that happen together, right? And it creates like this dependency. When one happens, the other happens, right? So when you're using these if-then strategies, you're using that. You're taking something that the child doesn't like to do and making it contingent upon something they really like to do. So like a perfect example is, let's say, and I don't want to use the homework because there's so many kids that I've met that do like doing homework. So I'll use a different example. But let's say it's, let's say for a younger child, maybe they hate picking up their toys. And every time you ask them to pick up their toys, it's this big battle, right? Well, that's where you can use an if-then strategy, where when they pick up their toys, then they can earn maybe time doing something they love, whether it's their favorite game on the iPad, or they can watch their favorite TV show, or they can earn their favorite snack, you know, whatever it is. It doesn't have to be, something they watch, or it can just be like something a snack they enjoy. So that's what the if-then strategy is. Now, the power of the if-then strategy also can be compounded by telling them that in advance, right? So you can tell your child, hey, remember, pick up your toys so you can watch your favorite TV show, right? And then, but here's the important part, is even if you say that, what's really important at the end of the day is that you come in and you deliver, right? So the minute they pick up their toys, you are coming in and saying, yes, go and watch that favorite TV show, or go and have your favorite snack, whatever it is, if the snack is appropriate at that time. So, it helps to come in and say that this can happen, but what really matters is that you come in and follow through. Because essentially, if you don't, what's happening is you're teaching your child that what I say doesn't happen. And then, and that's going to lead into other problems. So what's really important is, if you're going to give that antecedent of saying, remember, when you pick up your clothes, you can, watch your favorite TV show, that when they pick up their clothes or pick up their toys, you come in with that TV show. Okay. All right. So that's the if then. So now let's talk about ignoring junk behavior. So let's define what junk behavior is first. So it's those little behaviors, maybe sometimes not so little, but those little behaviors that are just kind of annoying, like the crying and the whining and maybe the rolling their eyes, particularly if let's say you have older children, let's say it's a teenager and they're rolling their eyes at you, where it's not a behavior that's essentially putting that child at risk per se, but it is something that's just, oh gosh, that behavior just, it gets under my skin, right? So that's what we kind of put under this umbrella of junk behavior. So why does it happen? Junk behavior can happen for a lot of different reasons. It can happen to get your attention. It can happen to get you to give in to something. Whatever the reason is, what's really, really important is that you first, and I'm actually going into bullet 2 here first, is that you stay calm and you keep your cool, right? One of the things when I was a trainer, and Yendri can definitely attest to this with her work now, is one of the things I used to teach my therapist is your poker face, right? And that's what I meant about keeping cool, because your poker face is one where you're not giving any kind of reaction. Because even if you're not saying something to the child, maybe if you just make a face where let's say they see that you're upset, maybe that's enough to keep that behavior going, right? So staying cool and not letting that junk behavior get to you is definitely the first step. Then the second step is either to remove your attention. So don't talk to them, don't make eye contact, don't yell at them, right? Because these are behaviors that don't present risk. So if you can ignore it safely, then ignore it. But if it's to get access to something, then you want to make sure that you not only remove that attention so you don't attend to it, but that you don't allow it to access, that you don't give in, right? And the thing is, at the end of the day, if giving in is giving them what they want, right? Whether it's something that they asked for and you told them no, for instance, or it's you paying attention to them. So my brother has a 15-year-old that I spend quite a bit of time with, and that's why I keep saying teenagers, because sometimes they're very, very persistent. She's very, very persistent, and essentially what I have to be careful of with her is that I don't give in, and I don't say anything to her, like, will you stop already? Because then all I'm doing is encouraging that behavior to continue. So that's something that you can do. But again, that's if the behavior is not presenting risk, because then if it presents risk, we're actually, that leads us into strategy 5, which is the next one after the one we're going to go into next, which is timeout. Now, timeout. This is probably one that we've all used in one form or another. So we're probably pretty clear on what timeout is. It's one of those situations where you say to the child, they do something, they yell, or they refuse to do their homework, and you send them to their room, right? And we're saying that's timeout, right? But what we have to be careful of is we understand that timeout means removing something, right? But what it needs to be removing is something that they like. We call that earning reinforcement, right? And so when you talk about using timeout effectively, you have to make this clear distinction between time in and time out, right? And they need to be very different, right? So the time in is the environment that's like filled with all kinds of things that they like, whether it's their toys or their favorite games or whatever it is, right? The time out needs to be devoid of that. And that's what I mean about making that clear distinction. And so one of the things that we can very easily fall prey to is we say to our child, thinking that we're using time out, and we say to the child, go to your room, right? But what does the room have? Is it really a timeout environment, right? Because the room may have a big screen TV and a PlayStation and all these other things, right? Now, I will tell you that for my niece, my 15-year-old niece, grounded just means telling her to go to her room without her cell phone, and that's enough. That's enough to distinguish the time in from the time out, right? So even though I'm saying that, sending the child to the room, maybe that's not a timeout. In some cases it is. So what I'm really trying to stress is you have to look at that timeout environment and make sure that that timeout environment doesn't contain anything that would encourage that behavior to keep happening. Okay. All right. Okay. So also during timeout, it's really, really important that just like with the junk behavior, that you're not paying attention to that. If they engage any of that in the time while they're in timeout and in the timeout environment, that you don't engage in that, that you don't pay attention to that, that you, just like with the junk behavior, that you keep your cool, right? Keep your poker face if they can see you. And so that's where you have to find, in terms of using timeout, you have to find out what works for you and what really is a timeout environment for your child. So let's try this next poll question, then we'll go into the last environment, and maybe we'll just have a few moments for some questions from you guys. So for this last question, when implementing timeout, should you A, give the child something to keep them busy so they stay in timeout, B, give them minimal attention, C, remove the opportunity to earn reinforcement for a particular amount of time, or D, both B and C? So give that one a shot. Okay, so let me share the results. This one got a little bit of a mixed bag. Somebody thought C, which is correct. That's absolutely correct. You want to remove that opportunity to gain access to the things that they like for a certain amount of time. But B is also correct too. So D is the correct answer here. All right, so then now let's go to the last strategy. And we had to add this one in because we talked about junk behavior and ignoring junk behavior when it doesn't pose a risk. So then Henry and I felt we had to give a strategy of when behaviors do present a risk. What do you do, right? And that's where this last strategy comes in, called response blocking. And just like it sounds, it involves physically blocking behaviors that present a risk. So if, let's say, in my career, and Yandri, I know you can attest to this, we've worked with a lot of children with autism, and a behavior that can occur is aggression. And that aggression that can happen is hitting, right? So if, let's say, the child is going to hit another child, well, that presents a safety risk. Not to that, it could be to that child as well, but it also is presenting a safety risk to another child. So this is where response blocking comes in, where it physically involves blocking that response, right? Not restraining, because you're not grabbing, but blocking that response to stop the behavior, so you can ensure the safety of the child as well as whomever else may be in harm's way. But what's really, really important with response blocking is, just like timeout, and you guys will see common themes here, just like timeout, just like ignoring junk behavior, you have to make sure that when you use this, that you keep your poker face, right? Keep your cool, keep your calm. Don't provide attention. And one of the things that I can tell you over my years of experience is that so much of the time we think attention is just talking to someone, but sometimes just merely orienting to someone is enough to continue to encourage that behavior. So really, it's try to minimize all of that so that way you're not encouraging that behavior from continuing to occur. Okay, guys, so those are we gave you 6 antecedent strategies and 5 consequence-based strategies for a total of 11 strategies that I hope you guys can find use for immediately the next time you're with your child. So on that note, I wanted to see if there's any questions coming in, but while we're pausing to see if those come in, just as we did last time, Yendri and I love talking to families and being available to chat with them and help them any way that we can. So here on the screen, we have our contact info. So you have my email and phone number, as well as Yendri's email and phone number. So on that note, I'll see if any questions come in. And I do see one. Daniela, thank you so much for chiming in. I see that you're asking for an example of response block, and that's a great question. So a perfect example, and response block, again, remember, is to maintain safety. That's really what it's all about. And so a perfect example is if, let's say, Danielle, in your case, I'm not sure if you're asking from like a teacher's perspective or a parent's perspective, but let's say you're a parent and there's you have 2 children, right? And let's say one of them is 3 and the other one is, let's say, 6, right? And let's say the 6-year-old let's say the 3-year-old took a toy from the 6-year-old and the 6-year-old is about to hit the younger child, right? That's where response blocking can come in, and you can actually go and instead of that child actually making contact, your older child making contact with that younger child, you would come in and block. But remember, so physically block. So if you can see I'm trying to give an illustration here, and it's kind of interesting to do this over a webinar, because usually when you show these strategies, you're face to face. So I hope what I'm trying to illustrate here on the camera is making sense. But imagine this is the aggression, you would physically block that response. Now, while you're doing that, you would definitely remove your attention. And thank you for giving more information, Danielle. I see that your child is 9. So definitely, if your child is 9, they're stronger, they're older. This response blocking technique, if they are engaging in any kind of aggressive behavior, can be very, very, very helpful, particularly if you're if you need to maintain that safety if it's presenting some type of risk. So I think if there's any other questions, I'll actually bring the floor back over to Annabelle, and because I think we're coming to a close here for our time together.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, guys. Thank you, Janet. Thank you, Andrew, for your help.
Absolutely.
If you guys have any questions, you can also feel free to email us or reach out to us at Janet or Yendri, or reach out to us at CARD for any questions. I will stop the recording now, and then we will